How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 51st video channel, and today we're going to be looking at Félix Guattari's 1973 lecture, Everybody Wants to be a Fascist, published as an essay in Chaosophy. I know it hasn't really been a month since our video on Melanie Klein's notes on some schizoid mechanisms, but some people have been asking about this essay in r/Guattari, and I feel that it offers quite a good window into his thought. It's quite an interesting text, as it demonstrates an overlap between his solo theorizing and that of Gilles Deleuze. He talks about univocity and multiplicities right next to desire machines and serialism. Without further ado, let's get into it. Guattari begins Everybody Wants to be a Fascist by stating that his notion of micropolitics does not imply any sort of bridge between Marxism and psychoanalysis. In his eyes, such a thing would be impossible for the simple fact that a system of concepts can't exist outside the collective assemblages of enunciation that give rise to it. To understand what this means, a small detour through 1,000 Plateaus might be helpful.
There is an assemblage of enunciation that is not given in my conscious mind, any more than it depends solely on my apparent social determinations, which combines many heterogeneous regimes of signs.
Basically, such an assemblage can provisionally be described as referring to a collection of diverse meanings, ideas, and so on, that all interact with one another, held together yet still not comprising any sort of totalized unity. When it comes to psychoanalysis and Marxism, concepts from the one are developed for a very specific set of conditions, making it difficult to apply them to the other. It's for this reason that Guattari is very careful to stress that he isn't borrowing from orthodox or Lacanian psychoanalysis when he uses the terms desire and libido. Rather, he has something else in mind, something I think would be valuable to understand before we go any further. Essentially, desire for Guattari, alongside Deleuze, is purely productive, rather than being based in lack. As can be seen in this diagram, it functions through always making connections. One desire machine couples onto another, like the baby's mouth machine linking up with its mother's breast machine, as detailed in the beginning of Oedipus. However, this isn't all. Desire is additionally tangled up in assemblages of enunciation itself, which problematizes two elements of orthodox psychoanalysis and attempts to translate its concepts into Marxism. On the one hand, as we saw earlier, this means that it isn't really viable to take it out of context. As he himself puts it, there's no such thing as desire in itself. That's to say, it isn't some kind of ideal formation divorced from history and society. On the other hand, this supposes the notion of an individuated desire, where you can clearly delimit where one person ends and another begins. To borrow a quote from the Three Ecologies, where he discusses mental ecology through the lens of anthropologist Gregory Bateson,
he has clearly shown that what he calls the ecology of ideas organizes itself into systems or minds, the boundaries of which no longer coincide with the participant individuals.
Much the same can be said about desire in Guattari's understanding of it, something we will explore in more detail in just a bit. What matters most of all for this section of the essay is the fact that desire can't be restrained to just a small scale of psychoanalysis, where it's a question of the individual and the family. Likewise, distinguishing between this level and that of politics is a mistake, on which Guattari states,
I would like to demonstrate that, on the contrary, there is a politics which addresses itself to the individual's desire, as well as to the desire which manifests itself in the broadest social field.
With this in mind, we can get into the body of the essay itself. The first order of business that Guattari sets for himself is the description of three different approaches to social struggle and organization. These are the Analytic-Formalism of sociology, the Synthetic-Dualism of neo-Marxism, and what he proposes as political analysis. The main focus here is to critique the former two in order to reveal their inability to truly deal with problems like fascism and the way they minimize the role of desire. To begin with the first and most problematic, the sociological analytic-formalist approach works through separating different structures into species through two processes, analogy and homology. The first is applied to small differences, working through drawing parallels between things like Spanish, Italian, and German flavors of fascism. The second, on the other hand, deals with structures. Through homology, small differences are flattened out in favor of more general species. Here's liberalism, there's communism, this is fascism. The problem with this is twofold. It reifies what it studies into sterile, solid things by simultaneously minimizing and magnifying differences. Additionally, completely discounts the role of desire, ignoring it entirely. In both cases, it shows itself to be completely dependent on representation, Deleuze's favorite punching bag. This is something that holds true for the synthetic dualist approach as well, on which, concerning sociology's ignorance of desire, Guattari says,
"The militant Marxist system of thought surmounts this failure, but constitutes itself as the collective system of representation of the masses' desires."
This occurs through a process that Guattari calls serialization, after Jean-Paul Sartre. However, before we get ahead of ourselves, understanding how neo-Marxism falls short in the first place would be well worth it. Essentially, it creates a gap between the desire of the masses and its representation through the insistence that they want revolution. The synthetic dualist approach mediates desire by simplifying it all down into the same mold, built on the basis of class conflicts and other similar duos, like the peasants and the workers, the East and the West, etc. In the process, it massifies the diverse struggles, experiences, and so on of a people in a manner that can only be described as cookie-cutter. To borrow Guattari's words once again,
"We have switched from the impotence of a system of mental representation to the impotence of a system of social representativity."
With this in mind, we can return to serialism. This is something that's covered in more detail in the Three Ecologies, but essentially refers to an impoverished form of subjectivity that's organized around an external object, rather than being self-determining. In the case of neo-Marxism, every dualism it sets up is mediated by a transcendent third term, the state, along with its power and the party that guarantees it. Essentially, everything is related to a very specific image, or perhaps representation, of how things ought to be, which in turn defines every struggle and subject as serialized. In Guattari's eyes, this is no different to the Oedipus complex of psychoanalysis that he tried so hard to overturn, where the phallic object acts as its third term. To finish off a section, as he says,
"It could be said that this dualism and its transcendent object constitute the nucleus of the militant Oedipus, which must be confronted by a political analysis."
So what exactly is this political analysis? Guattari begins his description of it by listing what it isn't. To start off with, unlike neo-Marxism, political analysis doesn't distinguish between social and individual problems. Like Deleuze and Guattari say in Oedipus, social production is simply desiring production under specific conditions. Moreover, it doesn't just order everything under the state, nor does it act as if all answers lie in a certain revolutionary program. Rather, it stands at odds with what he calls the Machinean dualism that he sees as contaminating radical politics. In other words, the insistence on binary oppositions that everything can be boiled down to, like the aforementioned struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. In his words,
"Therefore, a micropolitics of desire would no longer present itself as representing the masses and as interpreting their struggles."
It's with this that he shifts to actually explaining what political, or rather micropolitical analysis entails. Essentially, it affirms and centers on the multiplicity of objectives that exist in any radical movement. That's to say, class isn't the only thing that matters. There are also problems like racism, ableism, sexism, and so on that can't be ignored. In this way, he introduces what he terms singularization in other works, a form of subjectivity that's self-determining and regulating, celebrating uniqueness and heterogeneity rather than smoothing it out in the name of a serializing transcendent object. This singularization doesn't mean that party action and collective struggle wouldn't exist. On the contrary, Guattari instead sees it as necessary for any actual change to occur, causing chain reactions when multiplicities of desire connect together and catalyze the emergence of what was repressed because of insistence of serialism and representation. At this point, he describes how when something like this comes to pass, for example in May 68, there is no totalized unity of desire, subordinated under the state or what have you. Instead, political analysis insists on its nature as univocal. This, to me at least, feels like a reference to Deleuze's understanding of a univocity of being, a concept engineered out of a work of Duns Scotus, Spinoza, and Nietzsche. To quote from Difference and Repetition,
With univocity, however, it is not differences which are and must be. It is being which is difference, in the sense that is said of difference.
Essentially, saying that something is univocal means that it can be said with the same voice, without recourse to any sort of division or mediation. So when Duns Scotus, a British theologian of the late 13th century, spoke about the univocity of being, he was referring to the fact that what can be said of God can be said of finite things, like humans. However, in his understanding, it's univocal only insofar as it is indifferent. Be something infinite or restricted, it still is, albeit the two differ in intensity. Being in this sense is univocal to both God and modes, basically everything else, but doesn't cause or affirm the latter. Only God can do that. Spinoza radicalizes this and makes Univocity affirmative through his famous statement Deo sive natura, God, or better yet, nature. Here, substance and being are one and the same, hence attributes are absolutely common to both God and the modes, although there is still a qualitative essential difference between them. In this way, Deleuze doesn't think that Spinoza went far enough, since substance can exist independently of the modes, but not vice versa. It's only with Nietzsche that the abstract nature of substance, with most of its representations, gives way, an important step in the history of Univocity. Being, like stating the quote from earlier, becomes difference itself, something represented in this diagram. There's no longer any ground on which one thing depends upon another. Instead, there's only the continuous process of becoming, the eternal return and Deleuzian repetition. Although this has been quite the tangent, I hope this puts Guattari's claim that desire is univocal into context. Deleuze Philosophy has a fantastic video that goes over the role of Univocity in difference and repetition that I'll put in the description below, the place where I took the diagram from. For now though, we can see that, as Guattari himself puts it in Political Analysis,
there is no longer an ideal unity which represents and mediates multiple interests, but rather there is an univocal multiplicity of desires whose process secretes its own systems of tracking and regulation.
Desire, like being, is difference. Moreover, it is an equivocal in relation to the social field. That's to say, we can speak of desire in the same voice as we use for the socius. In this way, Guattari stresses its immanence, and the fact that it can't be conceptualized as a representation of some kind of abstract totalized unity, like the state of neo-Marxism. There's no hierarchy involved, since desire is ungrounded, although that's not to say that it isn't stratified according to all sorts of things, like class, gender, age, ethnicity, and so on and so on. At the end of the day, it's in the sense of being univocal that desire remains unified, even in spite of its singularity. Moving on, Guattari says that just saying desire is univocal isn't enough. Instead, to make praxis and an analysis of desire truly coincide, it's necessary to take count of the fact that it has a tendency to drift. In the same way, collective assemblages of enunciation always say something about this without specifically linking it to any specific individuation. In other words, desire from the get-go is implicated in complex movements of regulation and flight. Following from this, it doesn't suffice to just look at things after the fact, when society has crystallized specific relations of force. Rather, in Guattari's words,
the analysis becomes immediately political. When saying is doing, the division of labor between the specialists of saying and the specialists of doing ceases.
Assemblages of enunciation are complex things, which generate their own means of expression, be they new slang, a return to an old language, or specific special way of communicating. Taking shots at the Lacanian division between the real, imaginary, and symbolic, Guattari argues that these means involve all three at once. You can't truly distinguish between material, social, and semiotic flows on the level of expression. For the assemblage of enunciation, one is no different from the other. All sorts of things are implicated, from people themselves to body parts, or as Manuel Delante describes in A New Philosophy of Society, even radiation from atoms interacting with each other. Although this last example doesn't really mean much, I hope it shows just how broad expressivity is. For Guattari, it isn't tied down to any kind of object-subject relationship, and as such, it's impossible to take individual enunciations or statements as the basis of a political analysis. These only have a bearing in relation to pre-existing assemblages composed of a myriad of heterogeneous elements that act essentially as context, although this is a word he problematizes somewhat in the Three Ecologies. It's with this that he returns to the question of fascism and its relationship with Stalinism and so-called Western democracies. Guattari's aim is not to simply compare and contrast the three, like would occur in an analytic-formalist approach, but rather to complexify the models applied to them. It's not enough to just look at the three as if they form some kind of reified totalities. Rather, we have to go further and examine them on a more basic level. As he says,
these three groupings break up as soon as one begins to consider, at the heart of each grouping, the relative status of, for example, the industrial machine, the banking machine, the military machine.
However, we also have to keep in mind that this just represents a provisional stage in what he calls molecular reduction. Nevertheless, it allows for much deeper analysis. Rather than studying, for example, Nazism and Stalinism as two discrete structures, we can look at how their bits and pieces compare. Maybe the police machine is more similar in both than the state machine. Going even further into the process of molecularization, we can begin to work out the genealogy of fascism, seeing how things like the Nazi Party shifted over time in relation to the roles it had to play. Eventually, through this, we can get to the point where microfascism rears its ugly head, that basic form of fascism, which exists just as much in the family and the school as in 1930s Berlin or 1920s Rome. This isn't just some kind of static essence, but rather a forever mutating machine, one that existed long before Mussolini came into power, as illustrated by events like the Inquisition. In a word, it refers to the collective seizing of desire, something that obviously looks different from institution to institution, or state to state, which also transverses all kinds of structures. As Guattari himself puts it,
we must endeavor to disengage its machinic composition, much as we would a chemical composition, but a social chemistry of desire which runs not only through history, but also through the whole social space.
It's with this that Guattari takes a step back to praise some criticisms such a claim might lead to. At this point, he says, you can already imagine all those right-minded Marxists and psychoanalysts sarcastically remarking that everything's been mixed up and confused. However, Guattari counters that it's only from analyses on the atomic level that more complex things can be worked out. This is something that has become more important nowadays due to what he calls the molecularization of desire and production. No longer is it the case that a person works, but rather a collection of organs linked together. Remember here the message of Anti-Oedipus. We are all our own handymen, each person with their own little machines. To be a bit Delandian about it, a person is an assemblage composed of different elements connected together via relations of exteriority. There are all sorts of elements that make us up, what Dingy might call organ machines. These are themselves a part of a wide range of other assemblages, rather than being tied to some kind of totalized unity or another. In quite eloquent words, Guattari relates that
an individual does not communicate with his fellow humans. A transhuman chain of organs is formed and enters into conjunction with semiotic chains and an intersection of material flows.
To deal with this molecularization, where wholes become decomposed, totalitarianism has to constantly miniaturize and shrink down its means of repression. It's for this reason that an approach such as what we can now call micropolitical analysis is so important, although this isn't a term that Guattari himself employs. It's a mistake to take the molecular or minor part of names like these to mean that he believes tiny changes like the size of, say, Cleopatra's nose would alter the course of history. Instead, what he's getting at is the role of desire itself as it underlies the socius, and how the seemingly minor can crystallize out massive things. The case study of us here is of Hitler. As Guattari says, his role as an individual was negligible, in the sense that the Nazi Party formed something of a monstrous apparatus that extended far beyond Hitler himself. But we mustn't forget that he also acted as the catalyst for a new kind of totalitarianism, one we see reproduced all over the place, from policemen to certain gangs. They may know nothing of Hitlerism itself, but they nevertheless reproduce the same kinds of microfascist tendencies he embodied and ingrained into the social field. In Guattari's words,
the conjunction in the person of Hitler of at least 4 libidinal series crystallized the mutation of a new desiring machinism in the masses.
Before we can get into the specifics of what these libidinal series are, some context might be helpful. Essentially, the overarching question that our author wants to answer here is why did German capitalism side with Hitler, rather than, say, a military dictatorship? For Guattari, there's a fundamental difference in how fascism and militarism proper draw on the libido of the masses. It's here that the aforementioned series come into play. To begin with, Hitler's proletarian background was capable of drawing on those already used to the politics of the Bolsheviks and Social Democrats. Secondly, his military service, exemplified by his Iron Cross, was able to at least neutralize the army. Next, what Guattari describes as a spinal flexibility gave Hitler the ability to negotiate with capitalists, since it gave off the appearance of being easy to manipulate. Finally, as Guattari himself puts it,
Hitler embodied a racist delirium, a mad, paranoid energy, which put him in tune with the collective death instinct released from the charnel houses of the First World War.
Guattari is fully cognizant of the fact that this might all sound a bit too simple. However, the point he's making is that singular small-scale events can have massive consequences. It's not enough to just act as if history does what it does. In other words, you can't just fall back on the idea that individuals don't matter, and that there's some kind of historical necessity that we can submit ourselves to. Instead, a micropolitics of desire, to borrow his words almost exactly, wouldn't allow for any form of fascism to slip through the cracks, no matter what scale it is. On this note, he turns his attention towards the complicity of capitalism in the rise of Nazism. Guattari describes how we're led to believe that there's a real contradiction between the Axis and the Allies in World War II, something compounded by the fact that capitalists are often seen to be separated somehow from the fascist apparatus, particularly by Marxists who see Nazism as something of a band-aid to protect capitalism's so-called leaky tank. However, as Guattari says,
fascism only remained external to a certain type of bourgeoisie, which rejected it only because of its instability and because it stirred much too powerful forces of desire within the masses.
He goes on to describe how the alliance between the capitalist nations and the Stalinist USSR only came to be due to the fact that the latter seemed to offer a less destructive, more subtle way of subduing class struggle. At this point he moves on to the way that leftist opposition to Hitler and Mussolini seemed to essentially melt away in Germany and Italy respectively, rhetorically asking why they crumpled like a house of cards. The answer lies in the masses' libido and the inability of said opposition to truly tap into it. Basically, Nazism offered the means for an immediate crystallization of desire that distinguished it from the powerlessness associated with left-wing politics in the Weimar Republic. On the one hand, you had things like the application of economic solutions that, despite being quite short-term and unsustainable, were able to make Hitler and his acolytes appear desirable. However, on the other hand, and on a more fundamental level, you also have the Nazis directly investing into a collective death instinct, thanatos. As Guattari says,
by re-territorializing their desire onto a leader, a people, and a race, the masses abolished a reality which they detested and which the revolutionaries were either unwilling or unable to encroach upon.
Fascism essentially works by fusing the life and death drives together, linking thanatos to eros. In this way, World War II for Germany was essentially a fight to the death. Desire became paranoid, the figure of Hitler acting as a catalyst for the crystallization of a uniquely violent manifestation of it. At the heart of it all is for this reason that the Allies quickly sided with the USSR. It's not that they were defending freedom or any sort of utopian thing like that, but rather it simply appeared as a much more sensible alternative. The horrific explosion of deathly desire that launched Nazi Germany into war scared the capitalist totalitarian machine. Stalinism thus appeared as something like a replacement strategy, able to control the masses in such a way that would be less disruptive to the global equilibrium. To skip ahead a bit for the sake of time, Guattari now describes how all sorts of molecular fascisms are developing around the world. It may be true that the horrific death camps that characterize Nazism no longer exist as such, but still totalitarian machines enforce similar, albeit less obvious, alternatives. This is something we can see in the rise of racism and transphobia, to give an example of my own. To borrow his words,
we must abandon, once and for all, the quick and easy formula. Fascism will not make it again. Fascism has already made it, and it continues to make it.
In a word, fascism lies at the heart of everyone's desire, even if we may not know it, acting as a kind of paranoid kernel. Everywhere it exists, always in bits and pieces, but nevertheless there. Now on this rather somber note, we finish Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist by Félix Guattari, better understanding the nature of schizoanalytic desire and the rise of totalitarian machines. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something. If you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll be continuing our series on proofs and signs by Deleuze. Until then, bye!